matter how many levels are fused, and they found the more levels you have fused, and particularly going down to the sacrum, you increase the risk of dislocation significantly. And LF means long fusion, and SF means short fusion. You can see the long fusions are associated with a significantly higher dislocation rate. So this established this cause and effect approach, which is that the spinal pathology is leading to increased rates of instability, even with a cup placed in what we would typically say was a safe zone. If we go ahead and look at the spinal parameters, we have to look at the posture, the position, and the motion and relative motion of the spine when we move through our day-to-day activities. So there's lots of really fancy terms. I'm not a spine surgeon and I'm not the expert in this, so I tried to dumb it down. There's this anterior pelvic plane that you can see here, and then there's a functional pelvic plane. So the relative position to fixed anatomy, and then where we stand. So each individual position when we're standing. And you can tilt forward, back, or have a neutral position. You can see it diagrammed here with a person. And those also affect other parameters that you can then derive: the sacral slope, the pelvic incidence, and the lordotic angle. So these are the three different methods to qualify the changes in the pelvic tilt, going from sitting to standing. Normal pelvic motion involves rotating your pelvis posteriorly to protect you, if you can imagine, from dislocating posteriorly, and then rotating to stand up so that you protect yourself anteriorly when you're standing up. So this decreases the risk of impingement in all of us. In patients who have less than 10 degrees of tilt change, they have this increased risk of dislocation when they sit. So people will often say they sit in a standing position. And you can see that again here. And in some rare cases with this, obviously, outlier, they can even switch and be more standing, if you will, and have an even higher risk of dislocating when they sit. So the normal spinal pelvic motion allows you to protect your hip when you sit, but these patients with a stiff hip don't do that. So that's the basis. And again, you can look at all of these people, and what you find is individuals have slightly different changes when they go from sitting to standing. Here's an example of a pelvis, and this is just a rotation done on a plain and CT scan. And you can pick a lot of these up by just looking at your AP pelvis you obtain in the office. So if you see these outliers of an inlet or an outlet view, that can lead you to do a little more investigating. And again, the functional safe zone affecting the stability, both in flexion and extension. Oh, skip that one. So who needs the workup preoperatively? About 20% of patients. I thought that was a little high when they proposed it to me. I then looked through a few weeks of my patients in the office and found they weren't far off. Like probably 15 to 20%. And you can see the predisposing issues down below. So all the patients who go through this get a standing AP pelvis and a standing and sitting lateral radiograph. EOS is a fancier version that we have in our center, but this can be done without that. Some authors over in Australia have suggested actually getting a seated position really flexed forward, because that's actually the position of greatest risk. And every patient, again, is a little bit different. So they developed this classification system, and they presented it. And essentially, you look at spinal deformities that are stiff or have normal mobility, and normal spines that are stiff or have normal mobility, and they come up with this system. And again, I'd refer you to it. I think it's a nice, simple way of looking at this. But essentially, if you've got a stiff back that doesn't change when you sit, you can antevert your cup a little more. And paradoxically, if you have a flat back that anteverts your cup a little more when you stand, you can retrovert your cup just a little bit. So this allows you to find an independent or individual safe zone for each person. When they looked at the results of doing this, they looked at 2,000 of them. All patients underwent this previously defined sitting and standing evaluation. And they were broken down into high risk, intermediate risk, and low risk. They looked at a retrospective cohort who didn't go through this, that had a 3.1% dislocation rate at high risk, and it went down to 1 dislocation, 0.5% once they put them through this. They found the most important technique that they employed or changed was to go to a dual mobility articulation to improve the impingement-free range of motion. So if there's only one thing you remember from all of this, if you've got a really bad spine, using a dual mobility is probably a great option. When they found instability, they then tried to address it in a similar fashion. So again, using the sitting and standing spinal x-rays and determining where the spine was putting the cup in a relative position, then changing that cup during the hip revision. And again, they had a very simple algorithm to go through. And you can see here, when they applied this, they diminished the dislocation, subsequent dislocation, or recurrent dislocation down from 16% to 3%. And I'll point out that all the ones that they had persistent dislocations in were the 2B. And that's a very stiff, flat back. And the reason that's more difficult is that when you sit, those hips are at risk posteriorly, but when you stand, they're at risk anteriorly. So those are the really tough ones, and I would congratulate them on getting that number down so low. So without this protocol, 77% of the hips that they evaluated at the time of the dislocation would have been assumed to be in the right position. So they would have fallen into that type 6 or unknown classification system. So in summary, for the simple surgeon like me, the dynamic position of the spine does affect the stability of the hip. Stiff spines that don't rotate when you sit have posterior instability issues. Stiff spines that don't rotate anteriorly when you stand have anterior issues. You want to identify them preoperatively, obviously, and reduce the risk of instability by optimizing the cup position, increasing the offset, maximizing the head size, and I think going to a dual mobility articulation is a great answer. Thanks very much.